Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. As Gay mentioned, green burial is something that is very interesting to me. I have been able to visit a couple of green burial grounds in the United States, and the more I hear about them and the more I do research on them, the more I'm convinced that that's the way I want to go. Going green has become a very important thing with climate change, and a lot of people want to get back to the way it used to be. We're going to talk a little bit about green burial. We're also going to be talking about do-it-yourself home funerals. There's a lot more to that than meets the eye, so we'll be talking about that as well. If you have questions as we go along, please let me know. It's probably easier to answer the question in the moment than waiting till the very end. And the people on the webinar, if you have questions, then you can put them in the chat and Sarah will be happy to relay those to us as well. So we're just going to go ahead and get started now. Let's talk a little bit though about standard funerals and standard burial practices. This is in no way making any kind of judgment against funeral homes. Funeral homes are an industry and they're a needed industry. If we did not have funeral homes, we would have a big body problem. But a lot of the things that the funeral homes do, some of us aren't really that into. But the basic practices for funeral homes include transporting. That means transporting the body from wherever they died to the funeral home, and then of course transporting it to the place for burial. Cleaning and disinfecting the body, embalming the body in many cases. Also, if you're preparing that body for viewing, you have dressing the body, styling the hair, applying makeup, the casketing, the viewing and visitation, and the burial. And most burials, if they are in regular cemeteries, require the use of a liner or a cemetery vault. And that is so that the ground stays even and it makes it easier for mowing. So if you look at all of these different things, really none of this has anything to do, other than maybe cleaning the body, but none of it really has anything to do with the body and with the way that you choose to be handled after you die. And that's one of the things that really kind of bothered me about the whole funeral industry, is that the body becomes a commodity at that point. And how much are you willing to pay to make sure that that body, your body or the body of one of your loved ones, is handled in the way that you want it to be handled? Again, this is not anything against the funeral home industry. It's definitely a needed service, but we've gotten so far away from how things used to be and the care that we used to give our own loved ones. And what I would like to do myself personally is kind of get back a little bit to the little bit more personalized care and being able to say goodbye in a way that means a lot to me. So let's talk a little bit then about what is a green burial. Green burials are, pretty much in a nutshell, untreated wood caskets or a shroud. A lot of people are using wicker caskets now. It's something that needs to be biodegradable, that doesn't have chemicals in it. The bodies will not be embalmed. Many of the green burial spots do allow cremated bodies, even though cremation does have its own environmental impact, obviously. You don't have all the liners and everything that typically go in a casket, because most of those things are not biodegradable either. You also have the option of being a lot more hands-on, so to speak, with your loved ones. And part of that is maybe helping prepare the body for burial. If you choose to have a green burial, you might build the casket yourself. You might create the burial shroud yourself. You might help dig the grave, and you might help place the body in the grave. You might help fill the grave back in. So there's a lot of different options for people with green burial that you don't necessarily have with the traditional burial. Most burial grounds, most of the green burial grounds or areas in traditional cemeteries where they have green burial options do have certain rules. In this particular place, you can see the stone at the head of this plot, and it's made from fieldstone. So this particular burial ground does not allow monument type tombstones or gravestones. They don't have to be flat, but they have to be made out of natural stone. You can't just throw a big monument out here. You also notice that there is no grass. This is a natural wooded area, and they're required to keep it natural and keep it wooded, but they've also been allowed to put stones around it. So that demarks the actual burial place for this person. You see the flowers that are there, all the flowers and plants that are planted in this area and trees must be native to the area. So there's a lot of different rules that are in place for doing this, but having a green burial is absolutely possible. Now, we don't have any green burial cemeteries in this area that are specifically designed for green burials. We do have a couple of places that allow the green burials, but they have different rules and regulations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So with a green burial, again, we talked about biodegradable container or shroud. There are a lot of different containers out there now. There's biodegradable cardboard containers. Most of the green burials that I have seen, that I've seen pictures of or seen videos of, they're using shrouds. So they're using linen tablecloths, or the shrouds were actually made. Someone, I think it was Abby, when she was here, was talking about the different shrouds that were made that were actually like a long night dress or a long nightgown. As long as the person is buried in cotton or linen, something that is biodegradable, most of the green burial cemeteries will not allow any kind of polyester because it doesn't degrade very well. So you want to stick with the cottons, with the muslins, things that are made out of natural materials. Again, no embalming. One of the biggest problems with embalming, besides, I find embalming to be a very invasive procedure. Even though the person has already passed away and obviously is not feeling anything, personally, I find it very invasive. But the chemicals that are used in embalming are extremely dangerous. And they're extremely dangerous for the morticians. They're bad for the environment, but they're also for people who are doing the makes them sick. I read one study that showed much higher instances of cancer for funeral directors who actually do the embalming of people. So it's not a really good, environmentally, it's not really good for the environment. So a lot of people would prefer not to be embalmed. I will tell you that there's no state law in the United States that says you have to be embalmed in order to be buried. Now, some funeral homes, as a matter of fact, many funeral homes have their own rules if they are handling your funeral, that if it's not for immediate burial or within a certain time frame, sometimes it's 3 or 4 days, or on a viewing, that they insist upon you being embalmed. The way the choice of the person who is paying for your services, but there are a lot of different ways that people can be, that you can slow down that decomposition and still have a decent viewing and still have a fairly natural burial without having to be embalmed. So that's going to take a lot of education on our parts as well, because a lot of people think you have to be embalmed. You really don't. And you also don't have to be buried within 24 hours. There are ways that the body can be preserved for a little bit more time to give you a chance to plan everything. The idea of digging the grave yourself, Some people find that really, really difficult to think about. You mean I have to dig a hole that's 6 feet deep? Absolutely not. The problem with digging holes and burying people 6 feet deep is that there's no oxygen down there. There aren't any microbes down there that are feeding on the oxygen. So bodies don't decompose properly when they are buried 6 feet deep and embalmed and in steel caskets. Decomposition takes a long, long time that way. But in green burial cemeteries, you have to bury people 3.5 feet deep. So this is 3 feet. Add another 6 inches to that. That's as deep as my hole has to be. Okay. So if you have a yardstick, add 6 more inches, dig your hole 3.5 feet deep. That's all. And most regulations say that the body has to be covered by a minimum of 18 inches of dirt. By a minimum of 18 inches of dirt. And that allows decomposition to take place the way that it's supposed to take place. So I can dig a hole that's 3.5 feet deep. I don't want to, but if you want to be a part of that process, and more people are wanting to be a part of that process, then it's absolutely doable. But most green burial places allow you the option of digging the hole yourself, or they will help provide that service as well. Of course, they charge for it, but they don't charge anything like what a standard cemetery would charge for that process. Use plants and trees as markers, or use the native stone as markers. The green burial cemetery that I visited down in Texas, a lot of people had planted trees or shrubs, again, native to that area. And it was a really wonderful way for them to mark it. But you have a lot more possibilities of personalizing the burial and making choices that are right, not just for the person that you're burying, but also for the family as well, because the funeral and the burial is really not about the person who died. It's about those of us who are left behind. And one of the things that I have certainly noticed is that, all those added costs. Well, don't you think that your father deserves the best? Well, yeah, of course my father deserves the best, but I'm going from a $5,000 casket to a $10,000 casket, neither of which are biodegradable, by the way. So even though a lot of people ascribe to that, especially I'm from a much more urbanized area, but even in this area, as the 40s and still taking care of their dead at the home. They were still taking care of their dead. They were transporting their own dead to the cemetery, whether they were embalmed or not embalmed. They had a hand in digging the graves. They had a hand in filling the graves back in. When was the last time you were at a funeral and they actually filled the grave in while you were there at the cemetery? Never. This person said never. I've only been to one, and it was actually my brother's, and that was in West Texas 40 years ago. So I don't have anything to compare it to, but it's weird to me that we get to that point of saying goodbye, and then we all just leave. We all just walk away, and it's not finished yet. It isn't finished. So for me personally, that's something that I feel very strongly about, that we're getting that person to where they need to be, to quote a wonderful undertaker named Thomas Lynch. We're getting that person where they need to be so we can get to where we need to be as well. And green burial allows a lot more of that. I hate to say the word closure, but it allows us that next step in our grieving process and working that grief into our lives and figuring out how we can move forward with our grief and with that person not being with us anymore. And I think green burial is, honestly the way to go. Even if you're cremated, a lot of people have chosen cremation now, partly because of the cost, and I think partly because they think the cemeteries are running out of room. That may or may not be true, but we've got a lot of places where we could have green burial cemeteries and bury, I almost said plant bodies, but also take care of those cremated remains as well. So it's absolutely possible. What's holding us back? Regulations, lots and lots and lots of regulations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I wanted to talk next about, well, I'm just going to show you a few pictures here now. This is a place called Eloise Woods. It's down just a little bit southeast of Austin, Texas. And so you can see the plain pine box that is there. Over on the right-hand side, you can see how beautifully that body's been shrouded. And then they have laid the flowers over it. Over in the bottom left-hand corner, this is a small grave that's been dug here. And yes, that is a child's grave. If you notice in the top left picture where you have the pine box, you can see the big pile of dirt next to it. You never see that big pile of dirt at the funeral, at the cemetery, do you? They don't want you to see that. They don't want you to see the big pile of dirt. That way we don't have to think about that dirt going back into the hole where they just put our loved one. You know, it's all very sanitized. It's all very, oh, we don't want to talk about it. We're just going to take care of this and then we can get on with our lives. And the way American culture deals with death now makes it so that we keep everything at a distance. So we don't have to deal with it. We don't have to talk about it. We don't have to deal with it. We don't have to see the big pile of dirt over there. And that's one of the reasons why we're having these conversations, so that we can talk about it. I'm not going to tell any of you to go plan your green burial, although pre-planning is important. If you go to the funeral home tomorrow and plan your regular burial and plan on getting involved in everything, that's fine. That's your choice. But it's good to know that we do have other choices, and we just have to start working towards them and start fighting for them. But just being able to be in the same space with other people who think the same way or who feel the same way, that we should have more options, is a good thing, I think. So let's talk a little bit about home funerals, because this is one of those things that people are getting a little bit more used to green burials, but the home funeral is kind of weird and scary. But everybody used to do it. Everybody used to do it before embalming became the thing to do. Embalming was very, very popular war because people wanted their soldiers home. What they didn't want them to be buried somewhere. And then in World War I, even more so. We want our boys home. We want our soldiers to be home with us. So you can't bring them across the sea. And, you know, back in the 1860s, you couldn't bring them halfway across the country without them being embalmed. But home funerals have always been the way it's been done. You know, mostly people died at home. The bodies were laid out and prepared by the family, mostly by the women, because the men were out in the barn somewhere building a coffin, building a casket. We said coffin and casket. Are we going to go with coffin? They were building coffins then. Okay. So they were taking care of that. And all the neighbors were cooking food. And once the body had been cleaned and dressed in its finest, then it was laid out in the parlor. And someone stayed with that person with the body until the burial. And they did all sorts of cool things to try and keep the body cool. Hopefully it was winter when you died and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But they dug the graves themselves. They did all of those things. So it's not like we're coming up with this out of nowhere. It's the way that it used to be. And now we're just trying to get back to that a little bit. But home funerals, a Again, we get into the perception that we're not allowed to do that. You know, you can't have your loved one at home after they've passed away. Well, sure you can. Absolutely you can. I can call the funeral home if my mom passes, call the funeral home and say, my mom has passed away and I'm going to need you to be here in about, well, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. And if they get there before that, they don't get to take her until ready. You know, it's okay if you want to spend time with your loved one. It's okay if you want to have a part of taking care of their body after death. It's okay if you want to go to the funeral home and help take care of their body after death. But that's why pre-planning is so important, because they need to know what you want out of that experience. Planning and performing a service or ceremony, that can be done in your home, or you can do it in conjunction with the funeral home. There's very, very few regulations about you keeping your loved one in your home for several hours or even until the next day before they have to come and get them. Now, I will say that COVID has, being in the middle of a pandemic, has changed that somewhat, but under general circumstances, especially if the person died of old age, as long as it wasn't a crime scene or something like that, you know, if it was considered a natural death, someone passed away from cancer, not COVID, but from some other disease, then it really is okay for you to stay with them. And it's okay for you to be with them. It's okay if you have to go to the morgue and identify them, that you stay with them for a certain period of time. If your loved one dies in the hospital, it's okay for you to stay with them. Okay, we had a wonderful program last week called On Angel's Wings, and it dealt a lot with either babies who were stillborn or weren't expected to live much past birth. And the hospitals are getting much better now about allowing the family all the time they need with that baby. And it's a hard thing to talk about, but it's good for the families to be able to spend as much time as possible with that. And so there's no reason why we can't do that as well. The thing that we need is to be educated. And that's why we're doing a lot of this, is to know that we do have the right to say, no, I don't want you to take her yet. Or no, I'm going to following you to the funeral home, you know, or following you to the morgue or wherever they have to take them. It's a good idea to work with a funeral home or the funeral director so that all regulations are followed. Different places have different regulations. Again, there's no state law that says you have to be embalmed. There are laws about where people can be buried and about what can happen to that land where people are buried on. So it's good to pre-plan and to know what your options are before you get there. Has anybody, here in Missouri, there are a lot of different types of cemeteries, and it's like that in most states. I know Arkansas is like that as well. Here in the Springfield-Greene County area, we have cemeteries that are actually owned and operated by funeral homes. So they have state laws to follow, but then they get to decide if you need a vault or a liner, if you can use a cardboard box or a biodegradable container, or if you can do a more green burial. They get to decide. But as far as how much you get to be involved with that, they all have their own rules, which is why it's really important to plan ahead. If you don't want embalming, they should know that ahead of time. If your loved one does not wish to be embalmed, I don't want to be embalmed. I would love to be buried out in the back 40. At this point, if my husband buried me out in the back 40, he'd probably be arrested. So that's probably not going to happen, but I don't want to be embalmed. So if that means you need to put me in the ground within 24 hours, then let's get that done. And then you'll have a funeral afterwards or however you want to do it. But it's important that people know what you want, or that you know what your loved ones want. Okay. Some people can't even imagine being buried. You have a question?
Is Eloise Woods a 100% green burial cemetery?
It is. It's 100% green burial, and that's a terrific question. I will tell you, in Eloise Woods, they have been there, I want to say, since 2008 or 2009. And as we were walking around the park, we noticed some non-standard, I think, some regular gravestones, like in a real cemetery. So at some point, and those showed date of death to be around 2008, 2009. So at some point, they decided they did not want those kinds of stones there anymore, but they very nicely did not ask those people to remove the stones. Most of the stones that are there are flat field stones. Some people have created benches out of stones and done their own little monuments. And it's also, you can be buried with your pet there, which is pretty awesome. So people have buried their pets there, and they have acquired the space next to their pet so that they can be buried next to their pets. Or you can be buried with your pet. If your pet predeceases you and you have your pet's ashes, then you can be buried that way too. Unfortunately, in a lot of standard cemeteries, they don't allow pet burial at all. And if you want to be buried with your pet's ashes, you have to kind of sneak them. It's just really hard to do if it's a standard burial. Any other questions? Okay. There are no cemeteries that I'm aware of in Missouri that are strictly green burial. But there is a green burial cemetery up in St. Louis called Bellefontaine, that has a huge green burial section. And gosh, I should know this. How long have they been doing green burials? For a long time. Well, I mean, as it goes, they've been doing green burials for a long time. In Missouri, there's all different kinds of cemeteries, and down in Arkansas there are too. So there are old family cemeteries that are still being used by the family. You have the city cemeteries, municipal cemeteries. You have the cemeteries that are basically owned and operated by the funeral home. You have veteran cemeteries, which has a whole nother list of rules and regulations that you have to do. And then you have cemeteries that just seem to be there. And there's those cemeteries. There's a couple here in the Greene County area. I'm not going to name any names, but I will name names in Arkansas. There seems to be like one person everybody goes to. In this one cemetery, it's called Quality Ridge down in Mountain Home, and the guy's name is Dean. And you just call Dean. Dean will take care of everything for you. Dean keeps up with everything in the cemetery. He mows and everything like that. To be reset, it's really okay for you just to be having some audio difficulties. That's because it's right here. Is that better? Thank you for letting us know. But in those particular cemeteries that nobody really owns, but the people who are buried there or their families kind of work to keep it up, you can really do a lot of your own landscaping. You can, have different types of stone or just have a rock out there or things like that. So it's really important, first of all, to check and see what the regulations are for the cemetery where you want to be buried. And if they don't have any green burial options, then you need to check around and see what's available. Again, there's not a green burial cemetery in our area, but they're becoming more and more popular and more prevalent the farther we get into our educational processes. It's also very difficult with the green burials and the home funerals to get your funeral directors on board, depending upon who they are, because it does cut into their bottom line. I mean, this is a capitalist society, and people are in it to make a living, and I understand that. But there are several funeral directors in this area who are more than willing to help you out in whatever way that they can. But you'll have to call and ask them about what all they can do as far as how green a burial can I have. And that's usually what I do when I'm calling around to ask about the services that they have available, is how green can we go? What can we do within confines of what you require as a funeral home, what's required at the cemetery, and what the state requirements are. And quite frankly, the state requirements aren't that bad. The requirements that you usually run into are more municipal. They're either city or county. And they have some very specific ideas, depending upon the county, about where people can be buried and in what manner they're buried and how it's marked and what the land use is actually for and things like that. So it's can be pretty involved sometimes. But working with a funeral home on exactly what you want to do is very, very important. And going into it as educated as possible and with as open a mind as possible is really, really important. So as far as who provides green burials in this looks like a really, really short list. It used to be longer. Okay. These are the places in our area who say they provide green burials. And it's on their websites. And quite frankly, I didn't call this time. The last time I did this presentation, I called, but the funeral homes have really been slammed. And I didn't feel like making those phone calls to them when they're short staffed and time is of the essence. But these are the ones here in town. And I have Green Lawn on there. Green Lawn Funeral Homes runs North Green Lawn Memorial Gardens. I don't think they run East Lawn Cemetery anymore. I think at one point they did, but East Lawn Cemetery has a green burial section. So they do traditional burials there, but they have a section that's very specifically for green burials. You would have to contact them to find out exactly what their requirements are to do a green burial. And then Gorman Sharp Funeral Home will help you provide a green burial, but you have to go to the cemetery. It would have to be at one of the cemeteries because Gorman Sharp does not have its own cemetery. The city cemeteries like Maple Park, Hazelwood. Hazelwood does some green burials, but it's the Jewish portion of the cemetery, and that's part of their culture, is that they are buried generally within 24 hours. I know they do it fast. they've got it down. Generally within 24 hours if they're Orthodox and observant. And they allow for that, but it's not quite the green burial thing. And if you're not Jewish, you're not going to get that. So that's usually what they keep it for. The national cemeteries do not allow for green burials at all. A lot of the national cemeteries now do cremation, and and it's a space issue with them. They prefer cremated remains now, lots more than they do the full body. But honestly, the best thing to do is just to call and discuss your preferences so that you can understand what services they can make available to you, and what you have to decide ahead of time what you want. For years and years and years, I wanted to be cremated, and then I realized how much pollution that creates, and it was like, oh, natural burial, and literally for me, it's just dig a hole and throw me in the ground. Whatever else you need to do is fine. I just don't want to be embalmed. I just want to go, what is it? I want to be, that's what someone said last weekend. I just want to be dirt. And that's how I feel about it. How many of you are gardeners? People garden, you have a compost pile. That's me. Just turn me into compost. That's exactly what I want. That's exactly what I want to do. Something else that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, please.
So Avery Weeks has chatted to us, says she's a funeral director and embalmer from Herman H. Lohmeyer Funeral Home in Springfield.
Yay.
I want a green burial myself.
Mhm.
We are very pro green burial and we will help you plant. So Herman Lohmeyer, which we do not have on the list.
Thank you.
Avery, for speaking out for us.
Yes, Avery, thank you very much. Herman Lohmeyer Funeral Homes is honestly one of my favorite places. They're one of the funeral homes I was able to tour years ago when I was a student, and the their ability to answer my questions, because I had a lot of really weird questions. It was part of a death and dying class that I took at Missouri State University. I had a lot of really weird questions, and had some terrific answers, and they were very open-minded. So Avery, thank you so much. I will add you to the list. That's awesome. I didn't see anything on their website that was specific about green burials, and I didn't want to put any information up here that I wasn't positive about. The library has this book. It's called The Green Burial Guidebook, and it's written by Elizabeth, I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, Fournier, Fournier. And this has been an invaluable resource for me, because she did a lot of the legwork that I didn't have to do. I would like to share with y'all a little bit about my own hopes for having a green burial cemetery sometime. I can't even tell you when, but sometime in the not too distant future, I hope. I live just right on the edge of Greene and Polk counties, and there is some land that's close to me, that was in this person's family for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the gentleman who owned the land before the people who own it now was actually buried there, on the land. It's not a cemetery. It was a private burial. He's buried there with his horse. And it's a marked cemetery. I mean, it's a marked grave. And I'm hoping that I can talk to the owner of the cemetery, of the land that this is on, and maybe we can come to some kind of agreement to create a natural burial space there, since there's already a body there. That's a precedent. The problem is regulations, because if I just took my land, and this land actually butts up against mine, and I only have a few acres, how can we be sure that that land stays natural and an undisturbed burial place? How can we make sure? So a lot of times what will happen, and it happens with regular cemeteries all the time, is that the land is deeded to the city, the county, usually not the state, but the municipality where it resides, and it's kept in perpetuity. You have to tax people, or you have to, have the families pay fees or things like that. You can also create something similar to a nature conservancy, and that's what they've done in Eloise Woods down in Texas. They've created a space, and I think maybe the land was donated at some point, and they run on donations, and it's a nature conservancy. So nothing can be built there, and nothing can be changed, as far as you can't dig people up. You are allowed to bury your loved ones there, You buy a plot, you pay for that plot, and it will stay a graveyard or a cemetery forever. Absolutely forever. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at. I don't want to do anything there where it's going to be in charge, where a city or the county is going to be in charge of it. It's actually county property, but it's right there on the line. So I'm not really sure how that would work either. So I'm bitten off more than I can chew at this point. And with the pandemic, it's made it really difficult to talk to people about it. But I have some hope that the person who owns the property right now would be amenable to creating something like that with me. And so we'll see how it goes and keep everybody posted. In the meantime, there are options for the rest of us. One of the things I would have you consider, since there are so many small cemeteries around, not all of them are considered private cemeteries, especially if it's a cemetery that is attached to the church, like Turkey Creek Cemetery out in Walnut Grove. That's definitely a graveyard. It's a churchyard. But you might check with some of them to see if they would allow green burials. Not all of them require vaults. Not all of them require liners. I believe the law states now that funeral homes have to accept the casket that you choose. And so if you go to Sam's Club and buy your own pine box, and that's what you want dad buried in, then that's what they have to use. So you have some choices now. You can still use the services of the funeral home. You can use the services of the funeral home for preparing the body, for transporting, all those things, and still have a green burial. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition at this point. I'm not getting any younger. So the chances of me having a full-fledged, home funeral and green burial, that's probably not going to happen, but I can have parts of it. I don't have to be involved. I want to be buried in a shroud. Maybe that might happen. If not, just a plain pine box. I don't need a big fancy stone. Just engrave a pretty little stone for me. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. There's different gradations of it, and you can figure out what's available here and choose those things and make sure those things are going to happen for you. How many of you have, and I don't want to say advanced directive, because advanced directives aren't quite what you need for this, sort of, but not quite. You do kind of need an advanced directive for your burial, what it is you want. Don't put it in your will. And the reason I say don't put it in your will is read over there somewhere, well after you've been prepared and buried, and they've had the visitation and the party afterwards or whatever. You need that information needs to be front and center, so the people you love who would be taking care of that for you and signing off on things for you know what you want. And it's hard to know what you want if you don't know what's out there. So I'd like to show you a couple more shots here. So these are, all the pictures here are from Eloise Woods. Most of them we took while we were out there in February. But it's Austin, Texas is still pretty green in February. They have different sections that you can use. The Sweet Angel Garden is for children and for infants. One thing that Eloise Woods does for children and infants is that they donate the plot. So if there's a child death, then they will donate the plot to the parents, which I thought was really, really sweet. So I was just showing you a couple of things. These are cremated remains, but they have the field stone on them. This one was amazing. The family had done this after the burial, and that you can't really tell how high that mound is, but they've mounded like gravel and rocks, and and some driftwood and stuff. And it's about this tall. It's probably 2 or 3 feet off the ground. It was really, really high. And you notice in all of these, you don't have to worry about mowing. There's nothing that needs to be mown here. Everything's allowed to grow wild like it would no matter what you're doing. So that didn't come out very well. It just got the person's first name. And so this one right here is, there's actually, you can't really tell, but there's actually four plots there. So you can see the 2 in front, and then you can see the line in the back. And so they've encircled them all in stone. This was the most beautiful, peaceful place ever. And it was off of a fairly, I don't want to say it was a highway, but it was a well-traveled road. You could barely hear, the traffic sounds and everything. If you notice, oops, where did we go? Get back here. Sorry about that. And if you notice right there, they've built a little bench just out of stone so that they'd have a place to sit when they come in. There's another bench that's made out of stone and just a piece of slate. Some of the stones were really beautiful, very, very nicely done. There were a lot of Jewish burials here. Lots and lots of Jewish burials. I saw lots of the Star of David on different stones. There's one of the dogs. And they did have a little section for pets, but most of the pets we saw were buried next to people. Most of the stones were buried next to their people. And this one was really beautiful. They brought in the different colors of mulch and kept that up. And I asked one of the caretakers was there when we were there. And I said, did they come in and just keep it like that all the time? And they said, yes, that they come in quite often and do that. But it's natural, so they don't mind them having it out there. So does anybody have any other questions? So a lot of this information comes from the greenburialcouncil.org. Yes.
Are you aware of
The lady asked if I was aware of any religions that did not support or approve of green burial, and no, I'm not. As a matter of fact, we've talked about the Jewish culture, the Jewish faith. They prefer an immediate burial as quickly as possible. Also, Islam, Muslims also believe in burying as quickly as possible. And again, I'm not sure what that comes from, but I don't know of any. I know, in the different Christian denominations, having a church service and then a graveside service, and in American culture, it's like, let's wait. Nobody's going to be here until next weekend. So that means if you're going to have a visitation, if you're going to have a viewing, all of those things, you just have to weigh what you want with it. But I'm not aware of any other religions that just say, no, the green way is not the way to go. Okay. Most of the information that I've presented to you today, besides the local greenburialcouncil.org, they keep their information pretty up to date. You can actually go onto this website and find green burial options for every state. And I will tell you that there is one listed up around, it's Columbia, isn't it? Called Green Acres or Pushing Up Daisies. And I can't get a hold of them. I've tried for 2 years now to get a hold of them. And I actually drove by there one time when I was up in Columbia. And I mean, it's a pretty little place, but there's no information. I went by the place where they said their offices are and couldn't reach anybody there either. So I'm not really sure. I just wanted some information from them and I emailed and everything. So I'm not really sure if they're in business, but I know Bellefontaine is absolutely in business. So you can get information from them as well. And then Eloise Woods has a lot of good information there as well, about, where their money comes from and donations, and also about all the different things that they offer. I've gotten some good information from them about what it would take to actually open a green cemetery, for green burials only, not about regulations and stuff, but things to consider, that I also found in the Green Book.
Do they, for the most part, do they require that you work with a funeral home, or can you plan your own?
Oh, no, this comes directly from, they do home funeral, everything. You can do,
What if the family wants to plan a service and not involve any?
that's, in Eloise Woods, that's allowed. That is allowed. And I would prefer that what we need funeral directors for, besides just some guidance, they have a lot of good information. And again, that's why pre-planning is so important. They can help with death certificates and things like that. They can help with, you can do your own obituary. We did a program a couple of years ago on writing your own obituary. It was so exciting and so much fun to be able to do that. But it just depends on what the rules are. You have to have, there has to be a death certificate issued. So if you have your loved one dies in your home, then you have to let somebody know about that, so that a death certificate can be issued. In most cases, no autopsy is required and things like that. But doing it without a funeral director in this area is not really possible right now. You have to do it with them, but you can also do it where you can have the funeral at home. You just have to tell them that's what you want, and the big deal with having it at home at this point is transporting the body. And in a lot of cases with the Eloise Woods is that they just brought the body with them. They had it in the back of the truck or in the back of the station wagon. We had another question.
We've got two. And then we have- Got it. Okay. Can't a body be kept refrigerated until all family can attend? Is one of our questions.
Absolutely. The question was, can it be refrigerated until all the family can attend? Yes, it can. Here's the thing with that is a lot of the funeral homes, if you want to have a viewing or a visitation, the funeral home actually requires embalming. So that's, again, why it's really important to know your funeral home before you need to use them, to find out if they will keep the body refrigerated for you before you come. My mother lives about an hour away, so I'm not right there all the time. But my preference, she's already pre-planned everything. She's going to be cremated. Well, they can't cremate her until I get there. And they can't cremate her until one of her family members actually signs the little piece. And if that means that they need to keep her refrigerated for a couple of days while my brother and sister get here so that they can see her before the cremation, then that's what's going to happen. But she's not going to be viewed. There's not going to be any formal visitation or viewing of the body, so she does not have to be embalmed. And yes, some people get embalmed for the viewing and visitation, and then they cremate them, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that's what happens. Yes.
Bodies that are donated for science,
Uh-huh.
is there any choice other than cremation? Could that be requested that you have a burial?
Okay. The question was the bodies that are donated for science. Is there any other option besides cremation? Not that I'm aware of. And the problem with having a regular burial after a body's been donated for science to science is that we don't know where that body's going to end up. If you donate your body to a medical school that has different branches and things like that, you don't know what they're going to be doing with the body. You don't know if the body is going to be intact when they're done. So it would be really, really difficult for them to track that and then to get the body back to you for a natural burial when it hasn't been embalmed, and very likely something's been done to help preserve it for medical use. Did you have a question?
Yeah, do you know anything about composting farms?
Yes, she's asking about composting. How many of y'all have heard of human composting? Yes, it sounds awful, doesn't it? It's really not. It's another one of those things that there are people out there who are trying to figure out the best way, both for people and environmentally, that this is a sustainable thing. And there's human composting. It's actually started up in the Northwest, and California almost had it passed. And now there's different things going on because they had a big recall there and everything. And so it's kind of in limbo right there. But I think is it Washington or Oregon? Oregon and Colorado both have human composting now. And it's just how it sounds. I mean, if you go online, you can look under Ask a Mortician on YouTube just to see if they've got the video up yet. But it really is human composting. I mean, they lay out the body. Of course, there are no chemicals or anything. And then they cover up the body with a whole bunch of different organic materials and put it outside. And it's protected from animals and things like that. But the body will compost in honestly a very short period of time. It's like 6 to 8 weeks. The body will compost. And then they use that compost for, the family decides what they use the compost for. But yes, human composting is a thing. And I would go for that in a New York minute. But it's not available here yet. There's also hydrolysis, aquamation. Yeah, aquamation. And so there's different things that are more environmentally friendly. They're just not quite available here yet. And I don't know how many of you are from this area. Probably most of us have been around here for a long time. Things seem to get to the Midwest a little bit slower. So unless you're on one of the coasts, then it gets here a little bit slower, but you've already taken steps to get educated and to understand a little bit more about what's available. And the other place that we go is funerals.org. It's the Funeral Consumers Alliance is what funerals.org is. And they have a lot of really good resources and a lot of really good frequently asked questions, things you might not consider, things you might not think of. But again, I would definitely do your research. If there's specific things that you want to have happen to your body once you die, or the bodies of your loved ones once you die, then get on the phone and talk to people. Avery will talk to you over at Lohmeyer's. Just let them know what they want. Yes, ma'am.
We have a few comments and questions from our Zoom participants. So Avery did confirm earlier when you were mentioning that the funeral home has to abide by your wishes on whatever coffin that you choose.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a book recommendation, which the library also wholeheartedly recommends. Mary Roach's book, Stiff, The Curious Life of Corpses, has a lot of information about donating your body to science, if that's something you're curious about. Washington is also in the group of states that has passed composting, human composting. We just a giant thank you to everyone for making this happen, getting questions answered. Let's see. Do your preparations have to be in an advance directive? Going back to what we discussion from earlier, or some sort of legally binding document, or can it just be written down and given to a family member? Your wishes for after death.
For after death, it could be written down and given to a family member. It doesn't even really have to be written down. But I would write it down if I were you. If you want to put it as part of your advance directive, that's fine. But the person who's responsible for you after you die, or the people, because that one person could actually predecease you, they need to know what your wishes are. My husband knows I don't want to be embalmed. Beyond that, I don't have a whole lot of, I just don't want to be embalmed. Just please don't embalm me, because I will come back and I will haunt you because I don't want to be embalmed. But other than that, I don't have any preferences. Put it wherever somebody's going to find it. But it's a good idea for them to know about it ahead of time, because again, it's like putting it in your will. That's not going to do anybody any good. Putting it in your will, that's already too late. And having it in an advance directive might be okay, but the person who's making your healthcare decisions for you at the end of your life may not necessarily be the person who's dealing with your funeral wishes or funeral arrangement. So whatever you need to do to make your wishes known, make them known. They doesn't have to be notarized or anything.
What can we do to encourage human composting in our area? And our gardening community, I'm sure would help too, and I bet they would.
Yeah, I bet they would too. Human composting is so new, but what I would recommend is that educate yourself about it. Get online if you have access online, and obviously the people on the webinar do, or go to your local library and they will find out, they will get you some more information about it. If enough people say this is interesting and I think this is something that we need to do, we can band together and get it done. I would love to have I would love as many choices as possible. As many choices as possible so that people can make educated decisions and make decisions that are right for them. But yeah, you have to be an activist. You have to be an activist. Anything else? I think there's only one more slide. But if nobody else has any other questions, I think that's all we have to offer for this evening. I want to thank you all so much for coming.